The blade is already at his throat, and he still doesn't know who put it there. Look at his face, the shock, the watery eyes, the disbelief. Lim Woo-Jin thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought he could sell my life's work to the FBI for a quick payday and a chance to crawl into my wife's bed. He forgot one thing. I didn't find him in that gutter because I was lonely. I found him because I wanted a weapon. I spent $500,000 flying his mother to Italy just so she could walk. I saved his wife from a car wreck that should have buried her. I gave him the keys to a kingdom of gold and narcotics, and he used those keys to try and lock my casket. They say you should never wake a sleeping beast. Woo-Jin didn't just wake me, he invited me to his execution. And before the sun sets on this prison yard, I'm going to make sure the whole world knows exactly what happens to a son who tries to kill his father. Because in my world, the only thing more expensive than loyalty is a lie. The boardroom in Seoul smelled of expensive tobacco and cold ambition. Kwon Hyuk-Jae sat at the head of the mahogany table, his silhouette framed by the jagged glass skyline of the city he conquered. Around him, his top lieutenants, men with scars on their knuckles and fire in their eyes, vied for the vacant seat of the deputy. They spoke of blood, of territory expanded, and of enemies crushed under their boots. To them, power was a sledgehammer. To Kwon, power was a scalpel. He looked at their hungry faces and saw only liability. They were too wild to lead, too ambitious to trust, and far too predictable to survive the shifting tides of the global underworld. He didn't need another wolf. He needed a shadow. He needed someone whose loyalty wasn't bought with a percentage of the take, but forged in the fires of a life-or-death debt. Without a word, Kwon stood up, leaving his confused associates in the mid-sentence of their grandstanding. He had seen enough of the lions. It was time to find his lamb. The transition from the neon pulse of the city to the damp, gray silence of the Korean countryside felt like traveling back a century. Kwon's black luxury sedan crawled through narrow, mud-slicked roads where the scent of salt air and rotting fish replaced the smell of diesel. This was the edge of the world, a place where hope went to die. He found Lim Woo-Jin standing on a rotting wooden pier, his thin frame shivering against the biting coastal wind. The boy was barely 20, his skin sallow from malnutrition, his eyes hollow with the exhaustion of a man who had already given up on the future. He was currently hauling heavy, ice-slicked crates of fish for a pittance, his hands raw and bleeding from the cold. Kwon watched him from a distance. He didn't see a worker. He saw a blank canvas. He saw a boy who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. When Woo-Jin slipped on the ice, falling to his knees as the fishermen laughed and cursed at him, Kwon stepped out of the shadows. His handmade Italian shoes crunched on the frozen gravel, a sound that seemed alien in this desolate place. Kwon stood over the boy, blocking the meager winter sun. He didn't offer a hand to help him up. Instead, he offered a choice. He looked down at the bruised, shivering youth and saw the perfect weapon, vulnerable, desperate, and entirely moldable. They tell me you have a mother who cannot walk, and a wife who starves while you break your back for pennies. Kwon's voice was a low, velvet rumble that cut through the wind. Woo-Jin looked up, squinting at the man who looked like a god descended into a graveyard. He didn't speak. He couldn't. "Follow me," Kwon said, turning back toward the waiting car, "and you will never be hungry again. But remember this, boy. Once I pull you out of this dirt, your life is no longer your own. It belongs to me." Woo-Jin didn't hesitate. He stood up, wiping the fish scales and mud from his tattered clothes, and followed the lion into the dark. The transition from the dust-choked roads of a forgotten Korean village to the sterile, pressurized cabin of a private Gulf stream was enough to give Lim Woo-Jin a permanent sense of vertigo. He sat stiffly in the buttery leather seat, his calloused hands looking like jagged stones against the fine crystal glass of scotch he didn't yet know how to drink. Across from him, Kwon Hyuk-Jae watched him with the quiet, predatory patience of a man who had already seen the end of the story. "The dirt is behind you now, Woo-Jin," Kwon said, his voice a low hum against the jet's engines. "In America, men will look at your shoes before they look at your eyes. Make sure they see a reflection they're afraid to step on." When they touched down in New York, the transformation began with surgical precision. The threadbare rags Woo-Jin had carried from the East were incinerated, replaced by the suffocating luxury of $5,000 Italian silk. The first time he caught his reflection in a Fifth Avenue mirror, he didn't recognize the man staring back. The sharp lines of the charcoal suit gave him a silhouette of power, masking the hollow ribs and the lingering scent of poverty. He looked like a prince, but his eyes still darted like a thief's. Kwon didn't waste time on pleasantries. The education was brutal and immediate. In a dimly lit boardroom overlooking the Hudson, the boss laid out a digital map that pulsed with golden veins. This was the lifeblood of the empire. The gold smuggling routes stretching from the artisanal mines of Africa to the high-security refineries of Dubai, before finally being laundered through the jewelry districts of Europe and the United States. "Gold is the only truth in a world of paper lies," Kwon lectured, tracing a finger across the Atlantic. "Narcotics attract the police, fraud attracts the FBI. But gold? Gold is silent. It can be melted, reshaped, and reborn, just like you." Woo-Jin listened with a hunger that made his stomach ache. He memorized the shell companies, the names of the bribed port officials in Lagos, and the flight patterns of the private couriers. He watched how Kwon handled the logistics, not as a criminal, but as a ghost. As the days bled into weeks, the boy from the village began to fade. The way he walked changed. The way he spoke grew colder. He was learning the mechanics of a billion-dollar shadow, realizing that with enough gold, you didn't just escape the gutter, you bought the street. The transformation from a village boy to a prince of the underworld was nearly complete, but the final gilding of Lim Woo-Jin's soul required a darker currency, a debt of blood that could never be repaid. Kwon Hyuk-Jae didn't just want a deputy, he wanted a man who owed him the very air in his lungs. The opportunity arrived not through a business deal, but through a series of tragedies that should have buried Woo-Jin's past forever. It began with a frantic midnight call. Woo-Jin's wife had been involved in a devastating collision, her car reduced to a twisted heap of steel on a rain-slicked highway. While Woo-Jin collapsed in the hospital waiting room, his hands trembling with the realization of his own helplessness, Kwon moved with the cold precision of a god. Within 3 hours, a private Gulfstream was idling on the tarmac. Kwon didn't just offer sympathy, he bought a miracle. He flew her to the Black Forest region of Germany, where the world's elite surgeons worked in silence behind glass walls. Kwon spent $300,000 in a single week, ensuring that the woman Woo-Jin loved was stitched back together with the finest threads money could buy. But the debt was only half written. Weeks later, Woo-Jin's aged mother, the woman who had scraped the dirt to feed him, fell from a rotted staircase in the village, her legs shattered in a double compound fracture that local doctors whispered would lead to a double amputation. Again, the boss intervened. He didn't send a check, he sent a medical evacuation team. He flew the frail woman to the Rizzoli Orthopedic Institute in Italy, a sanctuary of bone and marrow where the impossible became routine. Woo-Jin watched as his mother was treated like royalty, her recovery overseen by men whose time cost more than a village's annual yield. Kwon stood beside Woo-Jin in the marble halls of the Italian clinic, his hand resting heavily on the younger man's shoulder. There was no mention of the bill, no talk of repayment. There was only the silent weight of the gold ring on Kwon's finger, catching the light. To the world, this was an act of supreme mercy. To Kwon, it was the ultimate investment. He had saved the two pillars of Woo-Jin's world, effectively purchasing the young man's life twice over. As they walked through the Mediterranean sun, Woo-Jin bowed his head in a gesture of absolute, tearful devotion. He believed he was bound by love, He didn't realize that in Kwon's world, every life saved was simply a marker moved on a board, and the debt of blood was now signed, sealed, and waiting for the interest to accrue. The silk of his $5,000 suit felt like a second skin, but beneath it, Lim Woo-Jin's heart hammered against his ribs with a frantic, primitive rhythm. He walked through the narrow, rain-slicked alleys of Seoul's Mapo district, the neon signs above flickering in shades of violent pink and cold blue. To the world, he was the crown prince of the Kwon Empire, the man who had the king's ear and the keys to a global kingdom of gold and narcotics. But tonight, he was something else. He was a serpent looking for a hole to crawl into. He stopped at a rusted iron door tucked between a boarded-up tea house and a steaming vent. A man stood there, shrouded in a nondescript trench coat, smelling of cheap cigarettes and government-issued coffee. This was Agent Miller, the man who would help Woo-Jin burn down the house that had saved him. "You're late," Miller muttered, his breath hitching in the cold air. Woo-Jin didn't apologize. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out an encrypted flash drive. On it were the coordinates for the next 3 gold shipments moving from Africa to Dubai. Shipments worth tens of millions. It was the lifeblood of Kwon Hyuk-Jae's operation, the very foundation of the wealth that had paid for Woo-Jin's mother to walk again and his wife to breathe. "This is everything," Woo-Jin whispered, his voice steadying as the adrenaline turned into a cold, intoxicating sense of power. The routes, the shell companies, the names of the port officials in Mombasa. Miller checked the drive on a handheld device. "And the price? You're sure about this? For a guy in your position, the risk seems disproportionate to the reward." Woo-Jin looked at the agent, a dark, sociopathic glimmer in his eyes. He wasn't doing this for the money, though the secret offshore account was growing. He was doing it for the thrill of the hit. He wanted to see if he could break the man who thought he was unbreakable. He wanted to prove that Kwon's mercy was actually his greatest weakness. $10,000, Woo-Jin said, in the usual account. Miller scoffed. "You're giving up $1 billion empire for 10 grand? That's pennies, kid." "It's not about the money, Miller," Woo-Jin replied, his face hardening into a mask of pure malice. "It's about the look on his face when he realizes he gave the keys to his kingdom to a ghost. I don't want his money. I want his throne. And I want to watch him lose every brick of it while he still thinks I'm his loyal son." He turned and vanished back into the neon fog, the serpent's whisper echoing in the damp air. He had just sold his benefactor's life for next to nothing, and for the first time in his life, Lim Woo-Jin felt like he was truly the one in control. The obsession didn't start with greed. It started with the scent of jasmine and the rustle of silk. Every time Kwon Sora walked into a room, the air seemed to thin for Lim Woo-Jin. She was the conch shell, a rare, protected beauty that belonged to the lion. But in the dark corridors of his mind, Woo-Jin convinced himself she was a captive in need of a savior. To him, Hyuk-Jae wasn't a mentor anymore. He was an aging barrier standing between Woo-Jin and the life he truly deserved. Woo-Jin began to play a delicate, poisonous game. He knew that to break a man like Kwon Hyuk-Jae, you didn't strike his chest, you poisoned his well. During the long evenings when the boss was deep in negotiations with the Nigerian syndicates, Woo-Jin would linger in the shadows of the estate, finding accidental moments to be near Sora. He would offer a sympathetic look, a lingering touch on a glass, and eventually the first drop of venom. "He's late again, isn't he?" Woo-Jin whispered one evening as Sora stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seoul skyline. "Business is a demanding mistress, Sora, sometimes too demanding." He began his cold calculation. Using his access to the syndicate's burner phones and offshore accounts, Woo-Jin manufactured a digital trail of infidelity. He planted high-end jewelry receipts from boutiques in Paris and Milan, items Sora had never seen, into the pockets of Hyuk-Jae's discarded suits. He sent anonymous, grainy photos to her private device, silhouettes of the boss entering luxury hotels with younger women, images Woo-Jin had carefully staged using lookalikes and tactical lighting. Each time Sora's eyes welled with silent tears, Woo-Jin was there to offer a handkerchief and a shoulder. He watched with a predator's patience as the trust that anchored the Kwon household began to fray. He didn't just want the empire's gold, he wanted the boss's most precious jewel. He blackmailed Sora with concerns for her safety, claiming Hyuk-Jae's secret lives were creating multiple heirs who would one day come for her head. He was a vulture in a silk suit, circling a dying marriage he had wounded himself. As he watched Sora retreat into a shell of isolation, Woo-Jin felt a dark surge of triumph. He was no longer the poor boy from the village. He was the puppet master, pulling the strings of a tragedy, unaware that the lion he was trying to cage was already beginning to smell the scent of a traitor in his own home. The neon lights of Seoul felt different to Lim Woo-Jin now. They no longer felt like a welcoming embrace into a kingdom he was meant to inherit. They felt like the spotlight of a stage where he was the only director. Kwon Hyuk-Jae was back at the villa, likely sipping expensive tea and worrying about his son's safety, unaware that the son had already slipped out of the house like a ghost. Woo-Jin arrived at a nondescript shipping warehouse on the edge of the Han River. The smell of salt and industrial grease thick in the air. Inside, the atmosphere was a pressurized chamber of international greed. To his left stood the Colombians, hard-faced men with scars that told stories of the Medellin jungles, their eyes cold and impatient. To his right, the leaders of the Nigerian fraud syndicates, dressed in deceptively expensive techwear, tapping rhythmic patterns on their encrypted laptops. For years, Kwon Hyuk-Jae had been the bridge between these two worlds, taking a massive cut of every gold shipment and every laundered dollar as the tax for his protection and infrastructure. Woo-Jin stepped into the center of the circle, the gold ring on his finger, the one Kwon had given him, glinting under the flickering overhead fluorescent light. "The old man is losing his grip," Woo-Jin began, his voice devoid of the stuttering humility he used in the boss's presence. "He's obsessed with honor and legacy. He's slow. He's expensive. And most importantly, he's under the FBI's microscope because he refuses to change his ways." The lead Colombian, a man named Carlos, leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "Kwon has the roots. He has the docs. Why should we risk a war with a lion for a cub like you?" Woo-Jin smiled, a cold, predatory expression that would have horrified Kwon. He slid a decrypted tablet across the table. "Because I just gave the FBI the coordinates to Kwon's next 3 major shipments. By next week, those routes will be ghost towns, and Kwon will be too busy fighting a legal war to notice that I've already established new paths through the Philippines and Dubai. I'm offering you a 100 times lower fee for the first 6 months. No protection tax, just pure, unadulterated profit." The Nigerians traded looks of calculated interest. The logic was undeniable. Why pay a king for the right to breathe when you could pay a traitor to own the air? "And the boss?" the Nigerian lead asked. "Kwon Hyuk-Jae is a relic," Woo-Jin whispered, his eyes dark with the lust for a throne that wasn't his. "By the time he realizes the loop is closing, I'll be sitting in his chair, and he'll be nothing but a memory in a shallow grave." As the syndicates nodded in a silent, blood-soaked pact, Woo-Jin felt a surge of power. He had sold the man who saved his mother for a seat at a table of wolves, and he didn't feel a shred of regret. The air in the high-rise penthouse was thick enough to choke a man. It wasn't the humidity of a New York summer. It was the suffocating weight of $1 billion vanishing into thin air. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city lights blurred into streaks of neon red and blue. But inside, the only light came from the cold, flickering monitors of the surveillance hub. Kwon Hyuk-Jae stood like a statue of granite, his hands clasped behind his back. On the screen, grainy footage from a Port of Savannah security camera played on a loop. Federal agents were swarming a fleet of shipping containers labeled as industrial machinery. Within minutes, they had bypassed the false bottoms, unearthing 500 kilograms of pure Colombian white and 3 crates of African gold bullion. It was a surgical strike. No broad investigation, no random search. They knew exactly which containers to open. Someone didn't just leak a tip. Kwon's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that made the junior associates at the back of the room visibly flinch. They handed them the manifest. They handed them my head on a silver platter. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the faces of his inner circle. For years, these men had been his brothers, his soldiers, his executioners. Now they were just shadows. Every twitch of a lip, every avoided gaze felt like a confession. The brotherhood that had built this empire was dissolving into a toxic pool of paranoia. Lim Woo-Jin stood to the boss's left, his expression a mask of practiced concern. He stepped forward, his voice steady, almost soothing. "Father, the rivals are getting desperate. The Colombians are whispering, and the Nigerians are nervous. Someone is trying to destabilize us from the outside." Kwon didn't look at him. He walked to the center of the room and picked up a heavy crystal decanter, pouring a drink with a hand that didn't shake. "The outsiders don't have the codes to the GPS trackers, Woo-Jin. The outsiders don't know the name of the captain on that vessel." He took a slow sip, the amber liquid burning down his throat. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the city. Kwon felt the beast stirring, the cold, calculating monster he had tried to bury when he brought the poor boy into his home. He had wanted to lead with a father's heart, but the world was reminding him that a kingpin only survives with a wolf's instincts. "Seal the borders," Kwon commanded, the glass clicking against the marble table. "No one leaves the city. No one uses an unencrypted line. I want every phone, every bank account, and every mistress of every man in this room turned inside out. If there is a rat among us, I will find him. And when I do, I won't just kill him. I will make his death a landmark." As the men scrambled to obey, Woo-Jin's eyes flickered toward the elevator, a microsecond of calculation that Kwon caught in the reflection of the glass. The hunt had begun, and the air was finally starting to clear. The rain over Seoul had turned from a drizzle into a punishing, rhythmic assault, mirroring the storm brewing behind Kwon Hyuk-Jae's steady eyes. He sat in the back of his black Rolls-Royce, the interior smelling of expensive leather and old secrets. Outside, the neon signs of the city blurred into streaks of bleeding red and electric blue against the wet asphalt. A shadow detached itself from a nearby alleyway. Detective Park, a man whose soul had been bought and paid for by the Kwon Syndicate a decade ago. The car door opened just enough for a gust of cold, damp air to swirl inside before the detective slid in. He didn't offer a greeting. Men like him only spoke when the truth was too heavy to carry. He handed Kwon a thick manila folder, its edges slightly damp. Inside was the contract, not just a business deal, but a death warrant. Kwon opened the file. The light from a passing ambulance flickered across the pages, bathing the car in a strobe of emergency red. There it was, the forensic report from the seized gold shipment. His eyes scanned the technical jargon until they hit the undeniable truth. The DNA recovered from the encrypted comms device wasn't from a rival. It wasn't from a disgruntled soldier. It belonged to the boy he had plucked from the mud. It belonged to Lim Woo-Jin. The betrayal hit Kwon with the weight of a physical blow, yet his face remained a mask of carved stone. He remembered the hospital in Italy, the way Woo-Jin had wept and kissed his hand when his mother's surgery was a success. He remembered the silk suits he had personally picked out for the boy, molding him into the image of a prince. Every dollar spent on Woo-Jin's family was now a poisoned arrow aimed at Kwon's heart. "There's more," the detective whispered, his voice trembling. He didn't just leak the roots. He's been meeting with the FBI. He's promising them your head in exchange for total immunity and the keys to the New York operations. He thinks you're blinded by your affection for him. Kwon looked down at the glowing gold ring on his own finger, then back at the blood-stained report. The blind spot he had for the underdog had finally become a target. He felt the mentor in him die in that silent car, replaced by the beast that had built an empire on the bones of far stronger men. Woo-Jin hadn't just sold secrets. He had sold the one thing Kwon valued more than gold, the father-son bond they had forged in blood. "Drive," Kwon commanded. As the car pulled away into the neon fog, he didn't feel anger. He felt a cold, surgical clarity. He had spent millions to give Woo-Jin a life. Now he would spend whatever was left to ensure the boy's death was a masterpiece of suffering. The son wanted the throne, but all he was going to get was the mark. The neon lights of Seoul bled into the rain-slicked pavement like open veins as Kwon Hyuk-Jae sat in the back of the black sedan, his face a mask of weary disappointment. Beside him, Lim Woo-Jin adjusted his silk tie, his eyes darting toward the boss with a hunger he could no longer hide. Kwon leaned in, his voice a low, conspiratorial rasp. "The Americans are closing in, Woo-Jin, and it's because of Choi. He's meeting the FBI tonight at the abandoned shipyard. If he talks, our gold routes from Africa are gone. I need him erased. Quietly. Permanently." Kwon reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, glowing gold signet ring, the symbol of the inner circle's highest authority. He pressed it into Woo-Jin's palm. "Take this. If the sentries see it, they will let you pass without a word. Do this, and the empire is yours. I'm tired, son. I want to rest." Woo-Jin's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the final obstacle. By killing Choi, he would be doing the FBI's dirty work while simultaneously securing his place as the sole heir to the Kwon throne. He didn't see the cold, predatory flicker in Kwon's eyes as the car pulled away. An hour later, the shipyard was a graveyard of rusted metal and salt air. Woo-Jin moved like a shadow, the gold ring heavy in his pocket. He found Choi alone in a shipping container, the man's back turned. Without a second thought, Woo-Jin lunged. The struggle was brief, frantic, and bloody. As Woo-Jin drove the blade home, his own blood splattered onto the handle, a small cut from the scuffle he barely felt in his adrenaline-fueled delirium. In his haste to flee the approaching sirens, Woo-Jin didn't notice the ring slip from his trembling fingers, clattering onto the floorboards next to the cooling body. He didn't notice the strands of his own hair caught in Choi's death grip. He simply ran, convinced he had just inherited a kingdom. Miles away, Kwon Hyuk-Jae stood on his balcony, watching the flashing blue and red lights in the distance. He held a secondary folder, the real plan. The police weren't there for a mafia hit. They were there because of an anonymous tip about a high-profile murder in progress, supported by irrefutable physical evidence. Kwon took a slow sip of tea, the steam rising to meet the cold night air. The trap hadn't just snapped shut, it had severed the limb. The boy he had raised from the dirt was about to return to it, leaving behind nothing but a trail of DNA and a gold ring that would serve as his one-way ticket to a cage. The beast was no longer sleeping. He was finally at peace. The gavel's final strike echoed like a gunshot in the sterile silence of the courtroom. Life without the possibility of parole. Lim Woo-Jin didn't scream. He simply collapsed inward, his silk suit suddenly feeling like a leaden shroud. He had gambled an empire for a shadow and lost everything. 2 weeks later, the sterile white of the courtroom was replaced by the oppressive, rusted gray of the high-security wing. Woo-Jin sat behind the reinforced glass, his face, once handsome and arrogant, now a map of twitching nerves and hollowed eyes. Then the heavy steel door at the far end of the room opened. Kwon Hyuk-Jae walked in. He didn't look like a grieving father or a betrayed mentor. He looked like an ancient, elemental force of nature. Kwon picked up the receiver, his eyes boring into Woo-Jin's soul. "I flew your mother back to the village yesterday, Woo-Jin." Kwon's voice was a terrifyingly calm rasp. "She asked where her son was. I told her he died the moment he touched that FBI contract." Woo-Jin began to sob, his hands trembling against the glass. "Please, father. I was weak. I was stupid." Kwon leaned in, the neon red reflection of the exit sign dancing in his pupils like hellfire. "You weren't weak. You were a serpent. And a serpent doesn't need a life. It only needs a skin." He hung up the phone without another word, leaving Woo-Jin screaming into a dead line. That evening, the humidity in the prison showers was suffocating. Steam swirled around Woo-Jin's ankles as he stood alone, trying to wash the scent of fear from his pores. He didn't hear the three men enter. He only felt the first blow, a heavy, wet thud that sent him spiraling into the tiled floor. He looked up, gasping for air, as a massive shadow loomed over him. The assassin didn't speak. He simply reached into a portable heating unit, pulling out a heavy iron rod. The tip was white-hot, glowing with a malevolent golden light that mimicked the ring Woo-Jin had once coveted. As the two men pinned his arms to the cold, wet concrete, Woo-Jin saw the end of the iron. It was the seal of the Kwon Syndicate, the lion's crest. "No, please, just kill me," Woo-Jin shrieked. The lead assassin leaned down, his voice a low growl. "The boss said you wanted his throne. Now you'll carry his name forever." The steam in the room turned to a thick, acrid mist as the hot iron met the flesh of Woo-Jin's forehead. The scream that tore from his throat was drowned out by the hiss of burning skin and the relentless, rhythmic dripping of the showerheads. When the guards found him an hour later, the traitor was gone, but the message remained, a permanent, charred brand in the center of his skull. The beast had claimed his debt. Lim Woo-Jin had everything, wealth, family, and a father who would kill for him. He traded it all for a shadow. This story is a reminder. Greed doesn't just blind you, it buries you. If you felt the heat of that branding iron, hit the like button. If you want more cinematic stories of power and betrayal, subscribe and turn on post notifications. Tell us in the comments, did Woo-Jin deserve a quicker death, or was the mark the perfect justice? Share this with someone who loves a good revenge story. See you in the next one.